Welcome to WorldWise Studio, where the world's biggest ideas become surprisingly simple.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving straight into a massive, kind of mind-bending macroeconomic mystery that honestly defies all common sense. We're talking about how nations actually get rich. And the craziest part, the clues to cracking this global puzzle are hiding right in plain sight, just waiting for us to piece them all together.
Okay, so to really understand this paradox, you have to think about the absolute extremes. On one hand, you've got nations that are just bursting with natural treasures. I'm talking sitting on endless oceans of oil, actual mountains of gold. Historically resource-rich countries in South America or parts of the Middle East, right? But then on the exact opposite side, you have tiny, completely landlocked countries or swampy little islands that essentially started with absolutely nothing. Some of these places are like 70% mountains, or they don't even have enough fresh drinking water to sustain their own people.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question. If having natural resources was the ultimate golden ticket, well, the map of the world's richest countries would look completely different than it does today. So why exactly do the countries that started with absolutely zero natural advantages end up with all the money? What is the secret formula they're using to completely bypass their geography? Well, here is our roadmap for cracking the code today. We're going to cover 1. The resource curse. 2. Singapore, selling trust. 3. Switzerland, uninterrupted compounding. 4. Norway, quarantining windfalls. And finally, 5. The ultimate wealth playbook. Let's jump right in. Part 1. The resource curse. So before we look at the big winners, we really need to understand the trap. You see, easy money from things like a massive oil strike can actually act like a super dangerous drug that ends up ruining a country's long-term future. Economists call this the resource curse or sometimes Dutch disease. And that term actually comes from the Netherlands back in the late 1950s. They discovered these massive natural gas reserves in the North Sea, and all of a sudden cash flooded in. But it inflated their currency so fast that their regular manufacturing and farming exports just couldn't compete on the global stage anymore. Those normal, healthy industries literally suffocated. The whole nation became addicted to just one single commodity. Meaning, if global gas prices crashed, the entire economy was going right down with it. It is a terrifying, endless cycle of boom and bust. Moving on to part 2, Singapore and selling absolute trust. Now, Singapore represents the exact opposite of that resource curse. When they were unexpectedly expelled from Malaysia in 1965, they were just a tiny, swampy island with zero natural resources. I mean, the situation was so incredibly bleak that their Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, literally wept on live television because he thought the new country was totally doomed. But out of that sheer desperation, they managed to engineer an absolute economic miracle using a playbook of 5 incredibly disciplined decisions. First off, they threw their doors wide open to foreign businesses right when all their neighbors were locking down. Second, they took their location and turned it into a massive, high-speed container port machine. Third, they realized human capital was their only real resource, so they heavily industrialized education to keep their workforce constantly upskilling. Fourth, they completely revamped the country's housing, moving 80% of citizens into public housing that they actually owned, giving everyone a literal stake in the nation's success. And finally, their uncopyable ingredient, deep political control. This meant they could endure short-term growing pains for massive long-term gains without their major policies flipping every single election cycle. And here's the really brilliant part. By paying their government ministers salaries that rivaled corporate CEOs and aggressively crushing any hint of corruption, Singapore proved a vital lesson. When you have absolutely no natural resources, absolute reliability becomes your greatest export. Huge global multinationals just flooded into Singapore because they knew contracts would be rigorously enforced, permits wouldn't require some shady under-the-table bribe, and the rules of the game weren't going to just change overnight. Basically, they monetized trust. All right, part 3, Switzerland, the compounding machine. Okay, let's leave the humid docks of Singapore and travel up into the freezing landlocked mountains of Switzerland. Now, for centuries, geography was actually Switzerland's worst enemy. They were historically so poor that their main export was literally their own people, working as mercenary soldiers for other European powers. But just look at this incredible timeline. From the end of their last foreign war in 1815 all the way through World War I, where they stayed strictly neutral, to passing their famous banking secrecy laws in 1934.
By the time World War II ended in 1945, the Swiss economy emerged completely unharmed, and they've just continued that endless chain of stability right up to today. While the rest of Europe was constantly burning their wealth in wars and revolutions, the Swiss just stayed neutral and kept their compounding machine running. You really have to think of neutrality not just as a moral stance, but as the ultimate long-term business model. I mean, while neighboring nations had to rebuild their infrastructure from rubble twice in the 20th century, Swiss factories, railways, and banks never lost a single day of operation. And the payoff for that? 200 solid years of uninterrupted peace, and compounding creates a pretty astonishing reality. The typical Swiss adult is now the wealthiest on the entire planet. And we're not just talking about an average that's skewed by a few mega billionaires. The median wealth shows that in Switzerland, being highly prosperous is practically just the baseline normal for everyday people. Basically, their poverty and rough geography forced them to build a genius economic engine. Since they were completely landlocked by mountains, shipping heavy goods across borders was ridiculously expensive. So instead of trying to export massive trains of steel or coal, these snowed-in farmers started making tiny, incredibly intricate watches. They realized that low-weight, super high-margin goods were their only real path to profit. They built this world-class apprenticeship system like a skills escalator for their youth, valuing master craftsmanship just as highly as a university degree. And because their currency, the Swiss franc, historically acts like an absolute fortress of value, it essentially forced their industries to never even bother competing on cheap goods. They had to focus entirely on premium perfection, dominating spaces like advanced pharmaceuticals and precision machinery. Now for part 4, Norway. Quarantining the windfall. So Singapore and Switzerland got incredibly rich by having nothing. But Norway? Norway is this rare, completely fascinating exception of a country that got mega rich by having everything. And miraculously, they didn't blow it. Just before Christmas in 1969, Norway struck one of the biggest offshore oil finds in human history. But instead of throwing a massive national party and spending it all, they boldly wrote 10 strict commandments to quarantine the cash far away from their local economy. Even before the money really started flowing, they passed laws making sure the oil belonged to the people, not private interests. Sure, they let foreign drillers in, but they strictly demanded that those companies teach Norwegians how to run the rigs, so they were harvesting the deep technical knowledge right alongside the cash. And the result of that extreme discipline? A massive $1.5 trillion global piggy bank. Trillion, with a T. They took all that oil money and explicitly banned it from being invested inside Norway. By pushing all that wealth out into global markets, they stopped their own currency from inflating and totally dodged the Dutch disease we talked about earlier. Because of this super smart strategy, the Norwegian fund now owns roughly 1.5% of every single listed company on Earth, meaning they literally own a tiny slice of the company that makes your favorite smartphone, your car, and even your favorite snacks. Honestly, Norway's success boils down to one fundamental mindset shift that every single one of us should take to heart. A windfall is not income, it is seed. They knew oil was a finite resource that would eventually run out. So, by turning a temporary geographic lucky strike into a heavily diversified portfolio of global stocks and real estate, they essentially transformed a short-term jackpot into permanent, forever wealth. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the Ultimate Wealth Playbook. So what does this all mean for us? Well, we can actually take all these giant macroeconomic miracles and synthesize them into a super practical playbook for our own lives. Because the exact same principles that build a trillion-dollar national economy scale down perfectly to your personal piggy bank. You can absolutely copy Norway by quarantining any sudden windfall you get, whether it's a big year-end bonus, an inheritance, or a tax return. Norway's golden rule is that they can only spend the expected real return of their sovereign wealth fund, which hovers right around 3%. They stubbornly refuse to ever touch the principal. And when luck strikes in your life, you can choose to do the exact same thing. Instead of immediately upgrading your lifestyle or buying a car that's just going to depreciate, buy a global asset. Quarantine the principal, live strictly off a tiny percentage of the growth, and just let that compounding machine run uninterrupted, just like Switzerland. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with something provocative to really chew on for your own financial journey. You know, it's incredibly easy to look at maps and judge entire nations for squandering their natural wealth. But wealth, at the end of the day, really just comes down to resisting the urge to consume today so you can compound for tomorrow. So ask yourself honestly, if you were handed a massive $100,000 windfall tomorrow, would you have the steadfast discipline of a Norwegian piggy bank, or would you catch the resource curse? Keep compounding, and thanks for joining me.